The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and FreedomSlips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, FreedomSlips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution.radio. I am your host, Diamond, from the Oppenheimer Ranch Project, and joining us is my lovely partner and co-host, Leah Shaper.
Hello.
Welcome to the program. We've got a banger of a show today. We're going to be talking about multiple topics. In the first half of the show, we're going to begin by talking about the most significant eruption in modern times, the Hunga Tonga eruption, and the fact that there may have been a precursor wave to the event. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll get into a famous person that most people don't know about, Auguste Piccard. And we'll talk about his record-breaking hydrogen balloon flight over 10 miles up into the stratosphere. Fantastic guy. We'll also mention why flat earthers use him and why they've tainted his name, unfortunately. The second half of the show is dedicated to paleontology. The first article we'll talk about is a 300,000-year-old elephant butchering site in India, which is kind of fascinating in of itself. And then we'll get into probably what is one of the most important Pleistocene paleontological discoveries in modern times. And it is the discovery of the first ever saber-toothed cat mummy. That's fascinating. See, saber-toothed cats are not really cats. Most people don't know this. But about 15 to 20 million years ago, they broke apart. Modern cats went one way. And what we're going to be talking about are myconodonts, which are what they call saber-toothed cats. They're very, very different. They've got different paws, and there's all kind of different things going on. Plus, they like to live in the snow. Kind of reminds me of a lynx, but a lynx is in fact a cat.
Yeah. Well, but also it's out of the myconodonts. You know, there's two other species of myconodonts, and one of them we have like many specimens of 20,000 specimens, and this one we didn't have anything for.
Yeah,
really.
and that myconodont that you're talking about is because of the La Brea tar pits.
Yes.
Yeah,
yeah,
exclusively. So we got lucky there.
Yeah.
Anything else before we dive in here?
Nope.
All right, if you're listening out on the radio, this gets replayed at 8 p.m. Mountain Time on our YouTube channel, Magnetic Reversal News. So go over and check that out later tonight, where you can see all of the visuals, and all the links to all the articles we discuss are below the video. So we begin with a mysterious signal that preceded the most powerful eruption of modern times. And in fact, we're talking about the January 2022 explosion over the South Pacific of Hunga Tonga, Haipei. That's a lot to say there, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Now, this unprecedented thunderous event rang the earth like a bell, sending shockwaves around the earth multiple times. It also blasted so much oceanic moisture into the stratosphere that it remains today, and we got the graphs to prove it. And it's the most studied volcanic eruption for a number of reasons. There has never been a volcanic eruption of this type that we ever knew about. So it has to get its own name.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. And as they study the details, I don't know why it took years to figure this out. Doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, I've been a little confused about that myself.
But what they did find, according to the authors of the study, was a wave or seismic precursor for this eruption. Now, it's pretty obvious when you read this article that that wave came from the event that triggered the eruption.
Mm-hmm.
So the eruption didn't happen until this event occurred 15 minutes prior to the boom. And the event was so large that it sent a seismic precursor wave 15 minutes earlier. So it has to be, see, typically seismic waves near a volcano, they're only detectable several kilometers away from the eruption. But this precursor wave was detected hundreds of kilometers away. And it must have been a huge seismic event to do this. Now, the authors are claiming that what occurred here at Hunga Tonga was like a big piece of the upper caldera, if there's a magma chamber, like under the ocean, cracked and fell in, or there was some seismic event that cracked the ocean floor, which allowed the ocean to rush into this chamber. Took about 15 minutes, and then you get the boom. Is that what you got out of it?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So the odds of this happening on any other type of volcano is almost zero. So it's really not a discovery in the sense where, hey, we just discovered this thing and now we can predict volcanic eruptions 15 minutes prior.
Which isn't particularly helpful.
No, especially if you were on that island. Like, how far away could you get before the tsunami hit you?
Yeah, I mean, that would be it, right? If you got a 15-minute warning and you were on an island that would have been in the line of a tsunami from this, if you left the coast immediately, you could probably get to higher ground to avoid the tsunami, but I don't think most people would react that quickly. They're going to sit there and think about it first.
Right, and the people that receive the information, the precursor seismic event, they've got to take it in, analyze it, say, yes, this is it. Then they've got to get on some platform to warn the people. How long does that take?
Right. I mean,
that takes the whole 15 minutes.
Right. Nobody wants to issue a warning like that on a dime, because what if you're wrong and you cause a whole evacuation and then people get mad? You know, maybe it's worth it, considering the threat to life that a tsunami can be. But yeah, like you said, it needs to be analyzed first to actually determine what it is. And in this case, I guess we didn't know what it was. So whoever observed this seismic wave must have been like, what the heck was that? And then, I don't know, this raises the question you asked earlier, why did it take several years to figure this out? Because obviously somebody noticed this and then would have quickly known about the eruption 15 minutes later.
Right. So the fracture that let the seawater and the magma gush into the zone at the seafloor and causing the huge explosive eruption of Hunga Tonga, it's the fracture 15 minutes earlier that set off the eruption. That typically doesn't happen with any other type of volcano. So this isn't even a thing that we can use in the future.
It's not
unless there's a volcano just like this one.
Right. Well, and I'm assuming that, well, two things. I get the impression that this concept that there was a fracture of the caldera that fell in as being the trigger, I get the impression that is an assumption.
Yes.
I don't think anybody's gone underwater and looked to verify that.
Well, and there has been a paper a year ago that came out that went against that idea. That idea had been around for 2 years. And so scientists started coming out and say that's not what happened based on whatever they said.
Right.
But I think that this rally wave, this precursor wave arriving 15 minutes earlier, a rally wave is a type of acoustical wave that travels on the surface of a solid body. And we're showing a graphic of what that looks like. There's vortices and then there's wavefront movement. It's basically the surface seismic wave. So it's the S wave from a seismic event. So there was definitely a seismic event 15 minutes before the eruption. And there's no way you can convince me that that event isn't directly connected to the eruption.
Right.
So clearly there is a connection.
Well, and I mean, I don't understand exactly why it has to be a collapse of the caldera, right? Couldn't that seismic wave be part of the eruption itself, just the initial eruption? Like we observe earthquakes before eruptions all the time.
Well, what could have been happening is magma could have been moving into the chamber, creating pressure, and then it cracked the surface of the crust because of the pressure.
Right, and then that caused the seismic wave.
It could have been a completely unrelated fault nearby that moved, which allowed water to rush into the caldera. Never before had that happened.
Right.
regardless, it was a seismic event and it has to be significant. The reason it has to be a significant event is because they picked it up 750 kilometers away.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big seismic event.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as for this leading to early warning systems for volcanic eruptions in the future, zero. There's zero chance that this helps in any way.
Mm-hmm.
But what it does help is to explain the events leading up to and causing this eruption.
Yeah.
That's about it.
Yeah.
And an eruption indeed. Here is the moment that Hunga Haipai erupted in January of 2022, and it blasted initially here equatorially 10 to 15% more moisture into the stratosphere, which by 2023 had moved towards the poles, and now in 2024 is evenly distributed across the Earth in the entire stratosphere,
Mm-hmm.
which has led to some of the most epic, catastrophic flooding we've seen worldwide in recent memory.
It was 146 million metric tons of water.
Wow.
Enough to fill 58,000 Olympic swimming pools.
I was just going to ask how many swimming.
I think I've seen that figure before, but
58,000?
58,000 Olympic
That's not
size.
that much.
In one respect, perhaps. But regardless,
because
obviously it's quite a lot of water.
The stratosphere is not filled with swimming pools. The water molecules are very far apart.
Right.
So if you take a swimming pool worth of water and spread each atom 5 inches apart, that's going to be a substantial amount of moisture up in the stratosphere.
Mm-hmm. Well, and obviously this mapping of the water vapor in the atmosphere is a clear indication of how different the atmosphere is compared to where it was in 2021 as a result of this eruption.
Yeah, and if you look at the scale, it's a tiny increase on the whole. The dark blue represents 1 part per million of H2O. That's it.
Yeah.
And that is a drastic effect on our weather systems.
That's interesting to think about.
Okay, anything else you want to talk about, Hunga Tunga?
Well, I'm a little bit perplexed as to why we haven't observed this phenomena before. Oh, and why, I mean, there are plenty of underwater volcanoes, correct? Or we really don't know that much about them.
Yeah, but none of them are like this particular caldera.
In what sense?
In that the type of eruption it produced has never been witnessed on Earth. We didn't even have it in the volcanological nomenclature.
Right.
Just like in the 80s, when the Isle of Surtsey erupted off of Ireland,
mm-hmm.
Never before that type of eruption has occurred or had been observed in geologic history. So they had to name a new type of eruption, which is now called Surtsean eruption.
Mm.
And so this eruption is, the Hungatunga eruption is ultraplinian, but based on the definition of that, it's not really ultraplinian. It needs a new nomenclature because it has other mitigating factors. So what it means is that we know very little about volcanoes and eruptions.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, with all of this categorization of types of volcanoes, I mean, the nature doesn't necessarily create categories of things. We do that, right? That's our what's the word I'm looking for? That's something that we're throwing on top, right? And so, I mean, there's not necessarily distinct categories of volcanic eruptions. I mean, we're just using that as an educational tool, but it kind of makes me realize, like, why are we surprised when we find an eruption that's different than the other types of eruptions? You know, it's like, this is a very organic process, just
and eruptions are based on the composition of the lava.
Right.
The more silicious the lava, the different shapes of the volcanoes, and that's why you get stratovolcanoes, you get cinder cones, and you get shield volcanoes, is because the composition of the lava is different, and it cools differently, and it builds up differently, and it has different viscosity. So it has different volcanic explosivity. Like Mauna Loa is never going to explode like Mount St. Helens.
Right.
And vice versa. Mount St. Helens is never going to erupt like Mauna Loa with this black basalt that slowly oozes out of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to blow its top off every time because that's the nature of those high siliceous magmas in the Cascades.
Yeah.
But these types of eruptions that are underwater and intermingling with ocean water are not the normal. The normal volcanic arcs are on land. The only time they interact with water is groundwater, and there's not much of that, so it quickly gets boiled off or shot up as a geyser. This is much different because it has all of the ocean on top of it that can interact with it, which is, it's hard to comprehend that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's trying to instantly quelch all of the magma in the chamber instantly at all times forever because there's an unlimited source as you're vaporizing the seawater on the magma chamber. There's an unlimited amount of water behind it.
Right.
It keeps coming.
Right.
And that's what caused that explosion to go up 70,000 feet.
Right.
Or higher. I've seen numbers higher. 82,000, I thought it was the final.
Right.
So, but listen to this. We've got volcanic eruptions we've never seen. We've got things called kimberlites that we haven't seen for millions of years. These are volcanic pipes that can be as small as 5 feet in diameter, where most of the diamonds on Earth are produced.
Mm-hmm.
These volcanic eruptions are estimated to shoot into space. So they're coming up at very high speeds from the mantle in very small pipes. Think of it, a 5-foot diameter pipe shoots out of the ground at 400 miles an hour or whatever and goes into space.
Yeah. Where you're going to get an enormous amount of pressure in that small diameter. So,
and then within an instant, the whole pipe is solidified behind it because it's so small. It's cooled and solid.
Right.
Filled with diamonds.
Right.
Yeah. So we don't know a lot about volcanism. And like we've been covering over the years here, at any moment, we can have a VEI 6 or 7 eruption. And the higher the VEI scale, VEI 8 and 9, some of the papers we've reported on in the last few years show that those types of eruptions have no warning whatsoever.
Mm.
So the bigger the boom that's unexplainable, the less warning you have.
Mm-hmm.
So like we see some seismic activity in some of these, what they call supervolcanoes, let's say Campi Flegrei, recently, last few years, having some seismic swarms. But we also are measuring ground deformation there. And we know how high the ground has gone up. They know exactly how much magma is under that caldera, and it's not going to erupt at VEI 7. Mm-hmm. Based on all the calculations, it has enough magma to erupt at VEI 3 or 4 right now. So if it does erupt, it's not going to erupt as a supervolcano, but a VEI 3 that is next to, I think there's 100,000 people within a few miles, it wouldn't be good regardless.
Right.
And we are overdue for a big boom.
Right.
All right, we beat that with a dead horse.
It's a dangerous earth we live on.
Yeah, and for some, they are inspired by it, and they risk their lives to go figure out what's going on. Like Auguste Piccard. He was a Swiss physicist, an inventor, and explorer that was known for his record-breaking hydrogen balloon flights, with which he studied the Earth's upper atmosphere, and he became the first person to enter the stratosphere. He did it in this aluminum alloy steel coffin that he is standing in front of here. Absolutely astonishing that these scientists would risk their lives like this. But it's like any other core sport or adrenaline sport. I think that they had just as much fun as they did doing science as they did flying in a hot air balloon. So the invention of this device, which allowed him to use a hydrogen balloon to take him up into space, was later used as some of the first submarines, which makes sense. If it can go up and be pressurized, it can also go underwater and do the same thing. So he had a record-breaking flight, several of them. First, he went up about 9.5 miles, which was the highest any human had ever been. And then the historic flight on the 27th of May, 1931, he set out to break his record, which he did. He went another mile higher, making it 10.5 miles up into the stratosphere in a steel coffin. Now, the good news is he had a buddy. He took his buddy with him. They were probably crazy. Look at him. That's him in the hatch.
I know.
This is literally on that flight right before they let go of the strings.
Yeah.
So the hatch was left open until they started going up in the air so they could look around. And then when they got up towards 10,000 feet and they need to pressurize, you close the hatch and seal it all up.
I mean, it's completely nuts, right? It's like the idea of doing this, of taking this on yourself, especially he did the 9.5 mile flight alone, didn't he?
Yeah, I believe so.
I mean, that's terrifying. You don't even have a companion with which to share your fear. It seems like the equivalent of doing a spacewalk or something for the 1930s anyway.
The fact that they didn't have many monitoring stations, they knew nothing about upper level winds.
Right.
Like when you skydive, you have to do the moment you take off, before you take off from the plane, you have to study all of the wind directions moving up in the air column you're going to fall through so that you know as you free fall where the wind will push you so you make it back to the drop zone and don't die.
Yeah.
These guys have no idea where they're going to land. Somewhere on the earth, hopefully, is what they're thinking.
Right. Well, that's the other thing that I found kind of astounding about it. They left from Switzerland, is that correct?
It landed in Italy.
I know it landed in Italy, but did they start in Switzerland?
Probably, yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, okay, so you're like one country over, but like still, you have no idea where you're going to land. You might land in the Alps somewhere in the middle of nowhere where
what if you get to the stratosphere and there's 800-mile-an-hour winds?
Right.
He didn't know that.
What if you land in the Alps in the snow and you have no equipment or food with you? Like what?
And most of the earth is the ocean. So in a giant steel ball, you're not going to fare very well.
Yeah. It's a terrifying idea.
All right. These guys are
This
crazy,
guy's got balls.
They did it. Here is an artist representation of how comfortable that steel coffin looks.
That too. Imagine, I mean, you land in the ocean or the Alps, and then this is the shelter you have, is this little ball that you have to crouch in.
Well, the good news is they developed new helmet technology for the historic flight where they stuffed a basket with a pillow, and just phenomenal technology there.
What is that? What is the point of that?
That was in case of a hard landing. I guess they tie these around their chin. You see the little boy here swooning in the background that he can't go up in the bubble.
I want to go, Daddy.
Yeah, so we've got video of that historic flight. It's fantastic. They actually have a film of the moments before he leaves.
And he's like in his, like regular clothes too. There's no special clothing or anything. It's just like a day at the office.
And there they go,
floating
his
spectacles.
I don't know what he's holding there. Is it he already doing a scientific device, or is he about to throw a souvenir?
It kind of looks like a kerchief or something. He's waving goodbye. I might not ever see you again.
Yeah, so he lived. They made it. They did it. And also what's fascinating about studying this topic is that he was studying cosmic rays. That we thought that Frank Oppenheimer was one of the first person to be doing that. And I didn't really get to the bottom of that. Did you find any info?
No, and I honestly, I didn't really dig into this particular topic. But I do recall that the first for Frank Oppenheimer was more like that he was the first to really understand what they were. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if there's a real great distinction in what Piccard was doing versus Frank Oppenheimer, but.
So unfortunately, the flat earth community, and here we are over at flatearth.ws, debunking flat earth misconceptions. In a popular science interview, Piccard reported to have said that when he was up there, now mind you, this coffin that he was in, this spherical aluminum alloy coffin, did have windows, but they were only 3 inches across and probably 4 inches thick. So they weren't very good to look through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So in the popular science interview, Piccard was reported to have said that the Earth seemed like a flat disc with an upturned edge. Flat earthers quickly interpreted this statement as if he was telling us that Earth is flat. But in reality, in other interviews, it is clear that he was convinced that the Earth was a sphere. In fact, in his writings about his expeditions, the word globe was mentioned several times. So he might have misspoke on that.
Well, he says seems to. Like he's saying it visually, it looks like that, but he's not saying that it is that.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, this thing that happens with the flat Earth community where they grab onto like any little minute potential statement that would support their idea is just absurd to me when there's so much evidence to the contrary.
And we have the article where he refers to the Earth as a sphere here, 10 miles high in an airtight ball. This is coming August 1931. What is the source of this? Popular Science, the magazine. Yeah, so there it is. All the links will be below. Now, the reason that Piccard probably didn't notice the curvature of the Earth, I'm showing you.
It's very subtle.
Because up at the altitude at 50,000 feet where he was, it is the beginning point where the curvature is discernible.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the very beginning of where you can start to see the curve. And he, in fact, noted that had he remembered to bring a ruler, he would have noticed the curvature, but he did not bring one. Because here is how unapparent it would be.
Yeah.
And because you're up so high and looking down at the Earth, probably the fascination of what you're looking at just being up that high supersedes you trying to locate the curvature of the Earth.
Yeah.
Because you're the first people to see Earth from that perspective. I mean, it must have been mind-blowing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. What a fascinating guy.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else about Piccard?
Well, it's not exactly about him, but I just have to share that this idea of what he did at this time, and as terrifying as it was, it reminds me a little bit of I saw this brief video footage of a woman who was hanging on to one of the guy ropes for a hot air balloon.
Yeah, I saw that.
Talking to somebody, and while she's talking, the guy rope wraps around her leg and the balloon goes up. And she's dangling and screaming. And I don't know the end of the story, how she got down. But when I saw this footage, my heart leaped for her. I can't even imagine how terrifying that must have been and how painful, too, because she's hanging from this rope, like wrapped around her thigh.
Well, I'll tell you what, a fascinating deep dive. If you look into the history of ballooning, just in general, back in the 1700s, people were dying left and right. They were totally insane, making fabric balloons and heating them with fires and then haphazardly flying around the European countryside. So ballooning is just the craziest thing and a great weekend rabbit hole to dive into.
Yeah. The only hot air balloon I've ever been in was one that was tied to the ground, right? It goes up. This is in Philly. Where was that? At the Art Museum? Do you remember this?
Yeah.
It goes up, but it's still attached to the ground. It was very cool, right? You get a cool view. It's kind of scary, but you're not floating away.
Yeah, hot air ballooning is one of those things. Not for me. Well, unless
and if you're into that kind of thing, come to Pagosa Springs because we've got all kinds of hot air balloons here.
And they
hot air
even
balloon
have basket
events.
helmets.
Yeah. Like, did they do that as a joke? I mean, it's pretty funny.
I don't think so. That's completely legit. Look, they have lab coats on. They didn't have plastics or anything back then. Everything was mostly natural.
Yeah, but a basket?
Yeah. So football helmets were just leather with no padding.
Right.
The helmets back then made no sense whatsoever and provided almost zero protection from anything.
I mean, it would make more sense to have a wood bowl stuffed with padding on your head.
Yeah, I would go there. All right, second half of the show is paleontology and discovery. And the first article we have is, who are these hominins? Paleontologists uncover mysterious butchering of a 300,000-year-old elephant. Now, the discovery of the 300 to 400,000-year-old elephant fossils and stone tools in India provides evidence of early human butchery, highlighting significant early human activities and the presence of extinct elephants. Not only that, it shows that hominins this long ago were pretty bold if you're going to try to kill an elephant.
Well, in this case, it appears that they did not hunt this elephant. It appears that they probably just found the carcass.
In most of the old butchering sites, what you find is this very thing, that what they found is a dead animal, recently dead. And what they do, these early hominins, they don't even eat the meat. They're smashing the bones to get the marrow because they figured out that that marrow can take them a long way.
Yeah.
Not only that, if the animal's been lying for a few days, the meat is going to be rancid, but the marrow is going to be fine.
Yeah.
Because it's contained in the bone. It takes much longer for the inner bone to go rancid.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really important in the sense that it identifies part of hominins that in some respect we've been scavengers, right? That there's a recognition.
Yes.
The reason you would eat the marrow is because it's going to be loaded with nutrients. So if you stumble on a dead animal, you're going to take advantage of that because those nutrients are so important for your survival.
Well, and back in this time in the Ice Age, all of the animals were much larger. So you've got all these megafauna, and then you have all these large predators. So what you would be living in is it would be an area filled with giant carcasses everywhere.
Yeah.
And so, why would we hunt animals when we've got all these dead ones lying around? We can just get the marrow from the bones.
Right. But we clearly did hunt very large animals too, which I was thinking about that and realizing that in one respect, that's perhaps a manner of very efficient eating, right? But you launch a big project to hunt down a very large animal, and then you don't need to hunt for a while, provided that you have a way to preserve that meat.
The evidence of hunting large animals is only recent. I think some of the oldest sites may be 50,000 years old.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a mammoth butchering site in New Mexico. We talked about 37,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the mammoth butchering sites are occurring right near the Younger Dryas. So at that point, it might be once there's hardly any animals and you can't just find them lying around, you got to go get them. So you have to change tactics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as I recall too, there's a theory that sometimes perhaps mammoths were hunted by basically like kind of cornering them and pushing them off cliffs and stuff like that.
Those were the earlier techniques, I think, that the earlier hominins were using that weren't Homo sapien.
Yeah.
There's tons of evidence of hunting sites near cliffs and kill sites like that have been noted.
Yeah.
You know, why get close to a big animal with a spear when you could just scare them over a cliff? I mean,
it's pretty brilliant, actually, right?
It's a no-brainer.
And again, it's worth doing because you get this huge amount of meat, especially if your community is large enough. That makes a lot of sense.
And look at the size and shape of some of these scrapers, knives, and stone tools.
Yeah.
Hundreds of thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
You know, some people think that just 12,000 or 5,000 years ago, the Native Americans were living just like this with tools just like this.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly there's something wrong with the timelines.
Yes.
Because when you go back before the last mass extinction and we talk about the Clovis people 13,200 years ago, they were making some of the most difficult bifacial points with center notches, paper thin, and killing mammoths with these blades.
And
the
that's
technology
a technique
is so advanced that it's almost not replicable.
Well, that's what I was about to say, right? Like you have people who have tried to replicate creating Clovis points and using that technique and with great difficulty. This is an advanced technology. It's pretty significant. So it's interesting too. You and I have talked about this a lot where, We see a climax in the technology for flaking stone. And then after that point, after the Clovis, the sophistication of the technology seems to drop off. So, perhaps, I mean, we've also talked
Well,
about the
not
Clovis.
immediately, because if you look at the bifacials
Yeah.
across the threshold from Clovis to Folsom, which would take you from 12.9 to 11.7, the Folsom technology is equally as intricate and stylistic. It's different only in the fact that the new points were for a different animal, not mammoths. They were for bison.
Yeah, I was going to say that, right? That the change in that at that boundary is really a function of the change of the prey that is available to you.
But after
So
Folsom, in the subsequent few thousand years, let's take it 5,000 years towards us, the technology gets much worse.
yeah,
It gets much more diversified, where each little clan or tribe has completely different technology than the other ones.
yeah,
So it's almost like there was a global knowledge before the catastrophe that made it across for a little bit and then was lost. And then what you're left with is small roving groups of hunter-gatherers that are creating their own new technology out of thin air.
right. Which may be a function of what the conditions were and what was going on, the changes that kind of broke people apart, right? So then you're left with groups of kind of isolated survivors that lose the old technological knowledge and have to kind of come up with their own.
Yeah, they know you use flint for knife blades, but they don't know how to make a Clovis point. So they noodle around, they find out their own way, and they get it done.
Right.
What's interesting is that if these are not Homo sapiens here, and these are their tools, if we go back 16, 17,000 years ago and look at all these Solutrean assemblages, there would be very little difference between what we're looking at on the table and those assemblages.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, for hundreds of thousands of years, we figured out all the tools we needed, and it never changed.
Yeah.
Until recently.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Right at the end of this last ice age, technology was very high in the sense of Clovis points. Right after the catastrophe, Folsom was still very high technology bifacial points. And then we got really nothing.
I wonder if on some level, maybe there's a contributing factor of the changes in the prey that's available to us. Like it's not as difficult to hunt, and so it's maybe not as critical to develop a certain point. I don't know. I don't know if that really makes that much of a difference, but maybe that's part of the equation.
Yeah, and after all the megafauna are gone, you're left with smaller animals, so you don't really need super high technology to kill a deer.
Right. Right.
But the point is that I'm trying to make is that maybe something else is at play. Now, what's really interesting is that this elephant is very hard to pronounce.
Yeah, I kind of got it earlier.
It's Paleoxonodon. Paleoxonodon, one word, real quick, blend it all together. It's not paleo because the A and the E are switched. It's a trick word.
Paleoloxodon.
Paleoloxodon.
Yeah, I think that's what it is.
Yep.
Because you can kind of pronounce that AE like an E.
And this skull is huge. The teeth are gigantic, which is why the scrapers are 8 inches, or the hammers or whatever they're using to get to this good stuff. And then there's 2 separate papers. We'll link you below. The one is the paleontology of the site here. And the second one is the human exploitation of said paleontology.
Yeah.
Did you see both of those papers?
I didn't look at them. I didn't do my homework.
What we should glean, it's pretty simple, is that humans have been doing the same thing for hundreds of thousands of years all over the planet, because a very similar site in New Mexico called the Hartley Mammoth Kill Site is basically the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no newspaper or internet back then. So how did the people in India know how to do the same thing that the people in New Mexico know how to do.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, I find it interesting too that there's an acknowledgement of the lack of other hominin specimens in India where this 300,000-year-old elephant kill site is, which is interesting. I wonder
So they
why
don't
that
have a
is.
hominin at that time period running around?
Um, I think maybe there's only like one other hominin in the area that's been discovered. Let me see if I can find that.
It would probably be Homo erectus.
It was the only fossil hominin was the Narmada human. I don't know what that is.
How do you spell it?
Narmada. I think it's probably just named for a place or something. But it was discovered in 1982. Well, I'll just read this paragraph. To date, only one fossil hominin, the Narmada human, has ever been found on the Indian subcontinent. Its mix of features from older and more recent hominin species indicates the Indian subcontinent must have played an important role in early human dispersal. Before the fossil's discovery in 1982, paleontologists only had stone tool artifacts to give a rough sketch of our ancestors' presence on the subcontinent. I mean,
so it is Homo erectus. It is
okay.
Homo erectus narmatus.
Okay.
Genus and species. Narmadensis, actually. Homo
Okay.
erectus narmadensis.
So it's really
Go ahead.
I forgot the word I wanted to use, so go ahead. It'll come to me.
Well, we talked in a show prior to this at the same time, I think 400,000 years ago, there was a Homo erectus log cabin that was discovered that we talked about, 2 logs that were jointed, preserved in a bog, same hominid.
That was Homo erectus narmadensis?
No, it was Homo erectus.
Okay, yeah.
So
that was Tanzania.
The Homo erectus is very intelligent, probably as intelligent as Homo sapien.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's any real reason to assume that any hominin is not as intelligent as Homo sapien, in my opinion.
Well, some of the earlier ones, like Australopithecus, very tiny brains, tiny heads. They couldn't have been that smart. They're more like microcephaly humans. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until the last 500,000 years that we have all pretty big cranial capacities. Some of the largest cranial capacity is Neanderthal, which is the hominid prior to us. Mm-hmm. We're the last one standing, but Neanderthals might have been much smarter than humans. They might have had better senses of smell, sight, other perceptions that humans didn't have, like super hearing. We just don't know, but they had much larger brains. I think 10 to 20% larger in most cases.
I wonder what how the cranial capacity of Homo floresiensis compares, right? Because Homo floresiensis is a little guy, but you could be a little guy with a big head.
Yeah, they had normal proportion heads. It's a more modern hominid, I believe, going extinct just 50,000 years ago. Mm. Same time as Neanderthals, maybe a little earlier, but probably for the same reasons.
Yeah. I probably said this before, but the existence of all of these different hominids, some of which clearly overlap in the time scales, it gives a lot of credence to things like, the existence of Homo floresiensis being like, we have fairy tales about dwarves, for example, right? And there is obviously some genetic component, I don't know if it's directly from Homo floresiensis, that has remained in Homo sapiens simply because we have dwarfism. I mean, that's a thing that exists. It doesn't come from nowhere. We have plenty of indication that different hominid species have interbreeded. Clearly, we have Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon in us.
In the United States, the Native Americans talk about the moon-eyed people, the Eastern cultures. This was a group of people whose existence existed at sunset and in the evening. The natives said that they would come out at night to do their farming and go back into their caves. They were tiny little white people. Could be Homo floresiensis. We just haven't found any of it. But there are burials in Kentucky, I believe, of these small people that have been found and are on private property.
Right. Which then makes, the attempt to hide giant skeletons really stupid. Right? Like if we can acknowledge small hominids, then why can't we acknowledge large ones. I mean, there's a reason why we have the stories that we do. They don't come from nowhere.
Well, and I think the reason they hide the giants is simply because they're in the Bible, and there's something extremely controversial about them that they're trying to bury.
Mm.
We're going to tie this all together in the next 15 minutes. I think that there is a reason why we don't have any information on the history of humans for the last 500,000 years. All of our books are basically in the last 5,000 years, and all the knowledge as far back as it goes, even Gobekli Tepe, it's only 11,500, 12,000 years old. We don't know what that means. They're
Right.
not even studying it to find out what it means. They put a roof on it and it's a museum and nobody's studying it.
It's it's absolutely crazy to me. Like uh, how is somebody not pushing hard to study this and figure out what it is? If they are trying, are they being stopped? Are they encountering resistance to doing so? I don't know the answer to that, but it's just insane to me. Like, why would you not want to completely dig into that and figure out what it is?
Well, I think I'm going to get to that in a minute. So you're looking at the saber-toothed cat mummy, the first ever found with intact skin, fur, and toes. It's a myconodont, and it is not a modern cat. It, in fact, is its own type of thing here. Now, it's not unique in the sense that it's the first mummy found in permafrost. That's the furthest from the truth. They have found almost every animal in the Pleistocene in the permafrost as of now, including, but not limited to, the 42,000-year-old foal that we discussed with actual blood in its veins.
And this is 35,000 years old, I think, or 32,
Yeah.
something like that.
32 maybe. We'll get to the date. We talked about live nematodes that reanimated that were 42,000 years. They just found those this year. Decades ago, they found a perfectly preserved entire steppe bison, which they named Blue Babe. It's in a museum. If you haven't seen it, go check out Blue Babe. It's insane. What makes it even more insane is the archaeologists or the paleontologists working on it were so weird that they cut some of the flesh and they cooked a stew with it and had a party. Yeah, absolutely bizarre. So go check out that story. We found perfectly preserved mummified cave lion cubs. 2 of them a few years ago I reported on. And when they did the dating, they thought they were brother and sister. They were actually 15,000 years apart in dates in the same cave. Mind blowing.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And let's talk about mammoths. They have found to date over 25,000 mammoths in the permafrost in Siberia alone. So we are not at a shortage of mammoth carcasses. And they've in fact been feeding these mammoths to sled dogs for millennia since the 1800s.
Yeah. It seems a little heretical to eat a 35,000-year-old animal, but I get it.
It's going to be freezer burnt, man. It's going to taste like the inside of a drawer. So this saber-toothed cat is perfectly preserved. What I find interesting is that half of it is gone and eaten. So the top half was somewhere. The back half completely got eaten almost all the way up to the chest. But the rest of it perfectly preserved. They've got, sharp claws. The color of the fur may not be true. It may have everything to do with the age of the animal, because lots of human mummies have red hair because of mummification, not because of the color of their hair.
Right.
But just a fascinating find. Yeah. And so because of all these perfectly preserved animals in the permafrost, they must be frozen the entire time until their discovery.
Yes.
Which means the Arctic has been perfectly frozen for a very long time.
Yeah.
And that brings us to catastrophes during human existence. Here is the last 160,000 years on Earth. The red area is since the Younger Dryas catastrophe, which is happening right about here. And the first book the first Sumerian script is the beginning of the red. So this is all of known human history that has been chronicled. This is how long Homo sapiens have been on Earth. How come there are no books for all of these great years in between?
Right.
And the reason is because there's been 15, if not 16, civilization ending events, which happen episodically and periodically, not on a clock cycle, but on the cycle of cosmic catastrophe. This is the great year.
Let me also throw out there too,
Mhm.
like perhaps there's no, even if some amount of some artifacts from previous civilizations were preserved, perhaps also there are no books because books are a modern concept in the sense that, like we've talked about the idea of Göbekli Tepe being a encyclopedia of astronomical data, let's call it that. You know, that is a book. It's just a book in a different form.
Right. And so I think the megalithic structures have the information embedded in their architecture rather than written down in something that can be lost.
Right.
And if you don't know about Von Deschen, what he uncovered in the 70s by studying all the archaeological sites was that the precession of the equinoxes is embedded in all ancient architecture. The question is, how in the world did they know about this zodiacal signal that takes 26,000 years to observe, unless we've been talking about it for hundreds of thousands of years, which apparently we have.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens on this clock is when we move through certain thresholds, which occur about every 6,400 years, we enter a window of high probability of ending civilization. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't happen. This particular flexure point, which is the 12,900-year-old flexure, tends to be the worst place to be. And unfortunately, it's where we are right now. The last time we were here was when the cometary debris came in, melting the ice caps, darkening the skies, and freezing the earth for 1,300 years. So what's down here on this flexure point? Well, 26,000 years ago was the onset of the deepest, coldest ice age ever. Prior to that, 52,000 years ago, was a Heinrich event when all this glacial ice moved south towards Florida, down the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody knows what causes that yet. We know they happen. We have no idea why.
Mm-hmm.
I think what's happening is the same thing at different scales. And we do have ice up in the Arctic. And if you were to send a meteor up into the Arctic Sea right now and smash it, it would create a tsunami of icebergs, and maybe we'd get a Heinrich event.
Right.
Maybe it would wash out. The Beaufort Gyre would release with all the icebergs, and they would move towards Florida.
Yeah. Well, and and if you are aware of a catastrophe cycle, then what better reason to have your quote unquote books be in stone, right? This is the way that you preserve knowledge of precession of the equinoxes, for example. That's how you pass that knowledge on across that span of years.
Yeah, and so in Hamlet's Mill, with Von Deschen's book, which covers the precession of the equinoxes, they uncovered this, and it was mind-boggling how people knew about the specifics and were able to encode it in their architecture. Shows advanced cultures far beyond anything we give them credit for.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we're the stupid ones, right? We're the ones who are putting our knowledge in books that aren't going to last. Well, now we're putting it on the internet, right? Like that goes poof in a catastrophe. Like where does that go? It's just, in the ether somewhere.
No wonder the natives pecked stone walls at overhangs to record the information in perpetuity for future generations.
Yeah. Yeah. And the irony in the fact that we look at that as primitive when in reality their technique will far outlast our current techniques. Find us tonight on Magnetic Reversal News at 8 p.m. Mountain Time on YouTube.
Great show. That was a boom.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.